talking about. We've got what we call the Dutch disease, for example, which is a proponent of mismanagement of sorts of oil. So if a country is going to depend on oil in terms of gaining revenue, then IMF, if they're funding and they're giving substantive provision, they'd have to be careful with IMF by virtue of what they call the extended credit facility record, which is an invocation of IMF Article 4 of their agreement, has laid down provisions under which Uganda would actually benefit and under what circumstances Uganda would actually entail to carry out substantive or proactive oil exploration without, going astray. So for starters, yes, go ahead.
Council, now, in your opinion, do you think the upcoming oil production can ably remedy Uganda's economy and global financial position as it stands now?
Absolutely. There's no doubt about that. There is no doubt. I mean, with this, we're talking about gold now. We're talking about black gold. There is no doubt that they're granting the money is going to help us. And as I told you, this money has got strings attached in terms of transparency provision that will be required. But also, we are mindful of the fact that we want to hit the other end, which becomes what they call a curse, the resource curse, like countries like Nigeria. So much as there is a good side of it, there is also a danger of the issue of corruption in our country. I mean, how many times have we seen money being given by IMF and being swindled by people? So that's perhaps the danger that you and I should be careful about.
Let's also talk about the legal framework. How binding is the legal framework for the various players in the upstream, and if you're to look at the midstream and the downstream, to cater for the interests of Ugandans in regards to employment and capacity building and all the issues related around the oil and gas?
Interesting question. When you read my book, The Law of Oil and Gas in Uganda, you'll be able to find most of these provisions there. But for starters, I know I'm trying to speak to the ordinary person. Uganda has got what they call a national oil and gas policy. And specifically, if you look at Section 7 and 8, it makes provisions for national, content in terms of the ordinary people to benefit. The idea is, how does the ordinary person get benefit out of this oil and gas, whatever activities are going to take place. We've got a number of laws that are in place, including legislations, SIs, that are, substantive enough to protect our interests. The question, however, is whether or not we have the goodwill to live to the letter and the spirit of the law. Perhaps that's the question that we should ask ourselves.
And do you feel the country will be in position to maintain the right back of human rights and development, especially observed now with little or insignificant cases that are actually rotating around issues like land acquisition process and then the issue of compensation?
That's a good question. I think I pride myself in one of being the first people who may have done a thesis in oil and gas, because at that time when I did my thesis at master's level in oil and gas, there are not many people were, and one of the questions I was asking the thesis is, why are you talking about oil and gas when you have no, case study? Uganda has not explored. And then someone told me the best way is to look at the projected study in terms of a comparative analysis with other countries. So when you compare, if you're doing a comparative analysis with countries like Nigeria, perhaps, Dutch on the other hand, we have what we call success stories chart, and then we have what we call sad stories or bad stories. So in terms of a study, I'm positive that this has a lot of good in terms of improving our GDP, but if we can only manage the resources substantially that come from this oil without corruption taking root. Because if corruption takes root, then we have got a problem. I know transparency, Ernst & Young has actually also given provisions in terms of what they call extractive industries transparency initiative programs that would help to guarantee fight against corruption. So some of those substantive provisions are there in the law, and the question is whether or not, as I said, whether we have the spirit to follow up this law in terms of engaging them and making them work for us, and not only stay in the books of law.
And do you feel the country will be in a position to maintain the right track on human rights and development, especially based on how little and the mere fact that we have very few issues to do with the emphasis, for example, on a minimum wage? And of course, a minimum wage bill is still one of the key things still being discussed in Parliament, but it's not yet come to pass as law. What's to be expected in such a time?
Yeah, that's another good question, because you see, as I said, many of the things are young. We're a virgin country in these areas. So we have to learn again, as I said, from other jurisdictions that have done it before us. But if you talk about things to do with minimum wage, when you look at these monies that have been given by IMF to Uganda, there are strings attached on them. And some of the strings is that you are liable, or you are required to undergo certain requirements to fulfill. When they actually sent a team from IMF, they came here, and the team found that 3 of the things that they were required were good, but only 1 required some kind of, perhaps correction or amendment of sorts. So in terms of human rights, yes, we may have a question to answer, because human rights may mean different things to different entities. You know, here we are in a country where some people call it my oil. That's the other question you probably ask yourself, whether or not we have equitable interests as individuals, or is this oil going to benefit a particular individual as opposed to the country at large. In countries like Qatar, or those Arabian countries, every individual in the country has got a gain or a percentage that they gain out of every oil that is drilled from the ground. The question is, you and I, do you have an interest as a Ugandan? Perhaps that's a better question we should ask ourselves.
And of course, when you get to realize, according to reports coming in, around 8,000 workers, both skilled and non-skilled, are said to be employed in this project. And when you look at the issue to do with the Social Security Fund, and they focus on the minimum wage, are there chances that these employees will earn some good money while they are employed under especially the non-skilled? Because you get to realize maybe the skilled labor may earn some good money, but how about the non-skilled?
Good question. One of the things that the national content policy brings is to guarantee that the ordinary Uganda should be able to appreciate, or perhaps even benefit from the remits of this oil exploration. One of the things they do is in terms of skill. They also do in terms of training. They also in terms of in bringing technology, new technology, and things to do with equitable, what they call equitable and substantive, benefits for the ordinary person. But you see, every time we talk about, there are deeper questions. Most of us go on the surface of it and argue in terms of money. But you see, the question is, you talked about land acquisition, for example. These are things that perhaps ask deeper questions. We're talking about varieties on the other hand. Should Bunyoro, for example, because we're talking about the Alberta and Graben area, should Bunyoro benefit better than Busoga on the other hand? Those are questions we're going to ask ourselves. So for me, I want to look at oil in a bigger perspective, rather than looking at it in a narrow perspective.
Now, Council, let's look at the Public Finance Management Act, for example. Does it hold enough power to effect proper collection, monitoring, auditing, and investing of such oil revenue in any way?
Public Finance Act, its essence is basically to control budgetary reforms, predominantly. Everything that has to do with budgetary, whether or not we have got substantive monitoring positions, whether or not we have got substantive budgets, how are these budgets going to be run? How are they going to, do we have a substantive budget that can be able to sustain our country over a period of time? So this act basically is interested in terms of planning and in terms of creating what they call sustainable development programs that you and I can enjoy as an ordinary Ugandan.
And can the African oil market attain independence from international consortium, OPEC, for example?
Wow, that's a question that that's a billion-dollar question. Why? Because you are just young. Every now and then you're forgetting around who's going to drill the oil for you. You're still suing one another, taking yourselves to court in London. You're still a baby. You don't even have, the knowledge. You are dependent upon either China or perhaps England. And then there are these arguments of my oil. So it's a whole puzzle, it's all mess. So you cannot begin arguing in terms of whether or not we can even go single-handed. I think the question is, we have to learn from these countries that have done the game before us, look at the strength, look at the beautiful things that they've done, and then look at the weaker sides of those so that we don't commit the same problems. So to me, I think that's what we should be looking at as a nation.
Okay, recently there were worries of climate protection, and the international community was apparently pushing to limit oil and gas production by around 74%. That is for the rich countries, and then 14% to the low developing countries as well. Are there any worries for the climate action?
Good question, and perhaps that is the best question of the day.
No, I don't.
You know why? Because you see, we must transit beyond natural, non-renewable resources to what they call renewable resources. When you look at my book, The Law of Environmental Law in terms of renewable energy, we're talking about areas where we're transiting from oil and gas. Countries in Saudi Arabia now are actually thinking ahead of oil and gas, because it's going to come when we cannot have, when people are going to come up with other carbon-related issues, perhaps solar energy, where we can be able to explore and use these renewable, energies as opposed to the oil and gas predominantly. So perhaps, in fact, one of the things that IMF recommends is to be able to look beyond oil and petroleum per se, and look at it in terms of renewable energies. And I think that's a serious question for the country to answer. If I met the president, for example, tomorrow, I would be really more excited about what he's going to do tomorrow than rather what we're going to do today, because tomorrow is affecting what's going to happen today, whether we like it or not. So to me, I'm thinking in terms of renewable provisions. And as I said, if you look at my book, The Law of Renewable Energies in Uganda, you should be able to have a glimpse of what we're talking about. And that's where many countries are now getting into. Because we all know the challenges of explorations, oil spills and the likes, carbonation, things to do with ozone layers and stuff. These days we're talking about what they call a blue economy. Things are changing. We're talking about the ocean losing its memory. These are things that should speak to your mind and me. We're talking about a new change where we have to encompass in terms of renewable and sustainable energy, rather than simply fixing our minds on this black hole because we're excited about it, and yet it's going to be depleted next day, and the funds are going to be consumed or taken by particular individual. Because corruption, obviously, as you know, is a root of is a very serious problem.
Council, lastly, in your final remarks, do you feel that East Africa and Uganda in particular, shall we be in a position to escape what you would call the oil curse? Now, for example, look at countries like Nigeria, Angola, Chad, where we ask ourselves what really happened. Iraq and Iran, quite a number of examples there.
Good question, and that's one thing I also handled, by the way, in my book, Escaping the Resource Curse. By the way, there's a very big book called Escaping the Resource Curse, this thick. But also when you look at my book, Oil and Gas Law, I talk about the resource curse. These are questions that are asked, but you see, even though we are following provisions and recommendations by Ernst & Young, what they call the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, those provisions, whether or not Uganda can actually accommodate, we're signatories, we actually ratified them. But the question is, do we have the will? It's one thing for us to have the law, it's another to have the will to implement the law. That's the question that I'm going to ask you.
All right. Thank you very much, Council. And indeed, this has been a very insightful discussion with you. And many thanks for joining us tonight.
Thank you, and God bless you. Thank you for your attention.
Have yourself a blessed evening and good night. Back to our viewers now. We've been having Council Isaac Lubogo Christopher, who is a lawyer and author with a special understanding in oil and gas. He's been giving more highlights about the book he wrote regarding the oil and gas sector, scrutinizing it more and more. Business Today does continue immediately after the break. We have more reports coming up shortly. Stick around.